psychological weapon, reality manipulation. What if the most dangerous psychological weapon wasn't designed to control your mind, but to make you doubt whether the world around you was real? In 1997, David Fincher released The Game, a film that looked like an elaborate psychological thriller about a wealthy banker named Nicholas Van Orton. But beneath the surface was something far more disturbing, a carefully engineered experiment in perception, paranoia, surveillance, isolation, and behavioral manipulation. And the deeper you investigate its production, the stranger the file becomes. Because The Game doesn't simply show a man losing control. It constructs a reality around him, and then begins removing every reference point he uses to determine what is true. A television speaks directly to him. Strangers appear to know things they shouldn't know. His home is violated. His money disappears. People become actors. Actors become threats. Coincidence becomes impossible to distinguish from design. And eventually, Nicholas faces the same question the audience does. How do you escape a system when you no longer know where the system ends? That is why this film belongs inside the Shadow Archives. This isn't a movie recap. This is File 002 of Psychological Weapons, and we're going behind the screen to investigate how the game was constructed, what David Fincher was trying to achieve after SC7, how the filmmakers engineered Nicholas Van Orton's psychological collapse, and why its central weapon, reality manipulation, feels even more unsettling today. Because almost 30 years later, we live surrounded by algorithms selecting what we see, platforms studying our behavior, personalized information environments, invisible surveillance, and systems capable of predicting what will capture our attention next. Maybe the game was never really about a game. Maybe it was about something much older and more powerful. The terrifying human need to trust our own perception. And somewhere behind the locked doors of this production, there is another question waiting for us. How do you manufacture a reality convincing enough that someone willingly becomes trapped inside it? To answer that, we need to return to where the experiment actually began. We need to open the production file. But before we go any deeper into this file, there is something important you can do to become part of this investigation. If you believe cinema can reveal something about the way our minds are influenced, observed, and manipulated, leave a like on this video. It may seem like a small action, but it helps these investigations reach other people who are searching for films that hide something beneath the surface. And while we descend into the game, I want you to think about one question. Have you ever experienced a moment when something felt strangely orchestrated, when coincidence, timing, or the behavior of the people around you made you briefly question what was really happening? Tell me in the comments, because this particular file isn't only about Nicholas Van Orton, it's about that fragile boundary all of us depend on every day, the belief that what we're seeing is real. And if this is your first investigation inside the Shadow Archives, subscribe to Shadow Reel. We're building something different here, a growing archive of disturbing cinema, hidden psychological mechanisms, strange productions, forbidden stories, and movies that become more unsettling the longer you investigate them. Each file connects to something larger. Each investigation takes us deeper. And psychological weapons may be one of the darkest sections of the archive we've opened so far. So stay close. Keep watching. Because from this point forward, we're no longer standing outside the game looking in. We're entering it. And the first thing we need to discover is who created this psychological labyrinth and why. To understand who built this psychological labyrinth, we have to return to the moment when the game was still only an idea, because long before Nicholas Van Orton began questioning reality, the filmmakers were already asking how much uncertainty an audience could endure. The screenplay was written by John Brancato and Michael Ferris, but the project eventually reached David Fincher at a fascinating moment in his career. After SC7 shocked audiences in 1995, Fincher had proven that a thriller could become something darker. An atmosphere you couldn't simply leave behind when the credits rolled. With The Game, he would take that psychological discomfort somewhere more intimate. Instead of hunting a killer, we would watch one man's perception become the crime scene. Principal photography began in San Francisco in August 1996 and lasted roughly 100 days, much of it filmed at night. Fincher resisted pressure to move production to cheaper Los Angeles locations because San Francisco wasn't just a backdrop, its financial district, old stone buildings, narrow streets, and steep hills gave Nicholas Van Orton's world the architecture of power, isolation, and old money. And Michael Douglas was perfectly positioned at the center of it. As Nicholas, Douglas projects control so completely that watching it disappear becomes almost uncomfortable. Around him, Sean Penn plays his unpredictable brother Conrad, Deborah Kara Unger becomes the mysterious Christine, while James Rebhorn, Carol Baker, Peter Donat, and Armin Mueller-Stahl populate a reality where almost anyone might be part of the conspiracy. Even Nicholas's mansion was carefully chosen. The production used the historic Filoli estate in Woodside, California, while other scenes moved through San Francisco locations including the Financial District, Chinatown, the Embarcadero, Golden Gate Park, and the Presidio. Some filming also took place in Los Angeles and Mexico. But here is where this forbidden production file becomes more interesting. Fincher and cinematographer Harris Savides weren't simply photographing locations. They were designing Nicholas's perception. His protected world feels elegant, controlled, and expensive. As the game invades his life, that visual certainty begins to fracture. Neon, fluorescent light, darkness, and unfamiliar spaces slowly contaminate the frame. The movie itself was becoming the psychological weapon. When the game finally opened in the United States on September 12, 1997, audiences saw Michael Douglas entering a conspiracy. What they may not have realized was that Fincher had constructed the conspiracy around them as well. Because the next stage of this investigation isn't about where the game was filmed. It's about how a filmmaker can manipulate what you believe while you're watching it. If you're still inside the archive with me, leave one symbolic phrase below. I don't trust the game. Because from this point forward, neither should you. And this is where the investigation becomes dangerous, because the game doesn't manipulate Nicholas Van Orton by telling him what to believe. It does something far more effective. It destroys his ability to know what to believe. When Nicholas enters Consumer Recreation Services, CRS doesn't immediately threaten him. First, it studies him. He is subjected to medical examinations, psychological tests, questionnaires, and strange visual exercises. His personality becomes data. His fears become vulnerabilities. His habits become potential weapons. Then CRS enters his world. Not like an enemy breaking through the door, but like a system that already knows where the door is. A television suddenly responds to him. A clown appears outside his home. A waitress named Christine, played by Deborah Kara Unger, seems accidental until coincidence itself becomes suspicious. His brother Conrad, played by Sean Penn, can no longer be trusted. Even the people trying to help him might be performers. This is reality manipulation. And David Fincher understood something essential about psychological control. You don't need to replace someone's entire reality. You only need to contaminate enough of it that certainty becomes impossible. That's why cinematographer Harris Savides photographs Nicholas inside a world filled with shadows, reflections, windows, and spaces that seem to be watching him. Production designer Jeffrey Beecroft reinforces that sensation through environments that gradually stop feeling safe. Even Howard Shore's unsettling score seems less interested in announcing danger than in suggesting that something invisible is already present. Fincher himself described the game as being about the loss of control, and the film turns that idea into a psychological weapon. Watch what happens to Nicholas. First, he loses certainty. Then privacy. Then money. Then trust. Then identity. And finally, he loses the one thing he believed could never be taken from him: control over his own life. But there is another layer. We are being conditioned alongside him. Every time Nicholas discovers that something was staged, we become more suspicious. Every stranger becomes a possible actor. Every room becomes a set. Every apparent escape might simply be another level of the experiment. CRS has entered our perception too. That is Fincher's real trick. The psychological weapon isn't contained inside the story. The movie itself becomes the delivery system. And once you recognize that mechanism, another disturbing question appears. What happens when this kind of reality manipulation no longer belongs only to cinema? Because outside this fictional game, systems were already learning how to watch us. And if you're ready to follow this investigation beyond the screen, leave one phrase in the archive. reality can be engineered. Because in the next file layer, we're going to discover just how close the game came to the world waiting outside the theater. And this is where the game becomes more disturbing than it was in 1997. Because CRS possesses a terrifying advantage over Nicholas Van Orton. It knows him better than he understands the system watching him. It studies his personality, follows his movements, learns his weaknesses, and then builds an experience specifically designed for him. Nothing needs to convince everyone. It only needs to convince Nicholas. Now think about the world outside the film. Every day, we move through digital environments shaped around individual behavior. Search histories, viewing habits, purchases, locations, clicks, and attention can become signals used by automated systems to personalize what appears in front of us. Two people can open the same platform and encounter radically different versions of the world. That doesn't mean David Fincher predicted social media or modern algorithms. The connection is more unsettling than prediction. The psychological mechanism already existed. Control the information surrounding a person, and you can influence the reality that person experiences. In the game, CRS does this physically. It controls actors, buildings, television broadcasts, phone calls, taxis, documents, and apparent coincidences. Nicholas believes he is moving freely through San Francisco, but increasingly every path seems to lead somewhere prepared in advance. And almost 30 years later, that idea feels strangely familiar, not because we're secretly living inside CRS, but because modern life has made personalized reality ordinary. Recommendations anticipate what we may watch. Advertising follows patterns of interest. Algorithms decide which fragments of an enormous information landscape receive our attention. The psychological weapon has changed shape. Fincher's 1997 nightmare required an enormous organization, hundreds of participants, and an almost impossible conspiracy. Today, influencing perception can begin with something as simple as deciding what someone sees next. And that's why the game survives as more than a clever psychological thriller. Roger Ebert described Nicholas as a man obsessed with controlling his life, while Fincher himself said the film was fundamentally about loss of control. The Criterion Collection later interpreted CRS as something even more fascinating, a distorted reflection of the movie industry itself. A machine manufacturing experiences while the audience voluntarily enters the illusion. Maybe that's the final psychological experiment hidden inside this file. Nicholas paid to enter the game. We buy tickets. We open apps. We accept personalized experiences. And then we trust the world presented to us. So perhaps the most dangerous question the game leaves behind isn't whether Nicholas could distinguish fiction from reality. It's whether we still can. File 002 can now return to the archive. But before we close the drawer, leave one final declaration beneath this investigation. Question the frame. Because sometimes the strongest psychological weapon isn't the lie itself. It's controlling the frame through which you decide what is true. The archive never closes. It only waits for the next file.